It's the Jude 23 Community Podcast. It's clarity for those who are curious or confused about all things Christian. I'm Jeremiah Wood, along with Nick Hardcastle, and we are calling this episode 21. Nick, it's interesting because technically it is now season 2 of the Jude 23 Community Podcast.
Are we going on a yearly basis? I didn't know we established that. Welcome to season 2.
I don't think we did. I was just thinking this morning, I was like, man, we started this in January of last year. And here we are, 1 year in, 20 episodes in. And here's to 20 more or more than that.
That's all. We'll take as many as the Lord will give us. Season 2. We're all about it. New location for me due to circumstances, so that's okay. Still in Wichita, but in my utility closet now. So
yeah,
that's always
had to be
fun.
close to the router.
But just happy to be here. Happy to be here with you, brother, and happy to be talking about the God's word. So just thankful for season 2.
Absolutely. Hey, give us an update on how you and your wife are doing. You guys are getting close to baby day.
Yeah, we're doing great. We're just kind of in preparation. So January 29th due date. I think everything's progressing right along. So we're just in the interim of it. Have our bags packed and ready to go to the hospital as soon as we need to. So we're pretty excited about it.
That's good. That's good, man. I'm excited for you guys. There's very little that I feel like is better than being a dad. Being a dad is an incredible thing. And you're just going to rock at it. I can't wait to watch you just kind of grow in that role and be the dad that you've been called to be. It's going to be good.
Well, I'm excited and definitely blessed to have, obviously good mentors in my life, like father-in-law, but also friends like you that are good dads that can ask real questions too. And just appreciate, the community that God's put around me, especially like you, brother. So, did you and your family have a good Christmas?
We did. We got to go to Florida for the week, and my kids loved it. We went to Universal Studios, and so the morning after Christmas, we got up at 3:00 in the morning. We grabbed a flight over to Atlanta, then down to Orlando, and we spent about 4 days at the park, and then turned around and came back, and everything was great. And then as soon as we started on the bus ride back to the airport to head home, 3 of us started getting sick, and so that was kind of a bummer. We got the influenza. I thought maybe it might have been COVID at first, but we tested and everything was clear with that, and so all of the symptoms just pointed to influenza, and the nurse said, "Yep, it's self-diagnosed, so it's probably what you got." And I said, "Well, okay." And it was tough, man. I hadn't been sick like that in a while. But we came out of it.
That's not fun. It'll take it out of you. Yeah, good.
It will. All right. Hey, do you want to, why don't you start us out? Read a little bit. Let's start in chapter 16. We're in Genesis chapter 16. We're getting ready to talk about Hagar and Ishmael.
Sweet. Okay, I'll start in chapter 16. Just start in verse 1. And if you want to stop me or anything like that, you go ahead. But we'll just go ahead and start reading through it.
Yeah, why don't you just read through like verse 6?
6? Okay, I can do that. All right, so Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 6. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne no children, and she had a female Egyptian servant, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, and it may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And so Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be done to you. I gave my servant to you, to your embrace, and when she saw that she conceived, She looked on me with contempt. And may the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your servant is in your power. Do as you please. And then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her.
It's good. Here's what's interesting about this whole story is we look at Abram, and Abram's just in his crazy cycle again, right? And I think a lot of this really kind of points back to uh, Genesis 1 in creation, but more specifically Genesis 3, where you have Adam and Eve in the garden, and things aren't going their way, and Eve has an idea. She has a conversation with a serpent and then has an idea of how things should go. And then Adam goes along with her. In the same situation here in Genesis 16, the chapters leading up to this point, Abram had things going good with the Lord. He was in a place of surrender and submission. He had just established a covenant with God, and he was just in a good place of, trusting the Lord, worshiping, trusting the story, following his lead, following his command. And all of a sudden, Sarai is unsatisfied with the current situation. And so she decides to take into her own hand and get for herself what God has promised to provide. And we see Abram doing the exact same thing Adam did and is going right along with it.
Yeah, I think it has major Genesis 3 and 4 vibes to it, especially whenever you start looking at some of the language, because it says specifically in there that, Sarai took Hagar and gave her to Adam, her husband.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of the same thing replaying in the garden again, where he took and gave.
Mm-hmm.
But then as well, there's a lot of decreation in it as well.
Explain that.
Um,
What is decreation?
well, I mean, I guess I would kind of define that more as not participating in the creation in the kingdom that God has planned for you in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's that, God intended humans to be able to rule in his kingdom together. But he also says in there very specifically that, in Genesis chapter 4, that there's like a beast crouching at the door and you must
Right.
overcome it. Well, if
Right.
you choose to kind of participate in the decreation side, you're allowing that beast to take control over you, and you're allowing that beast to be able to kind of determine your means and who you are. So we see, really honestly, in this situation right here, Sarai is kind of treating Hagar and just like livestock, or like an animal,
Right.
and
Right.
just trading her back and forth, as opposed to being a good steward of someone that God's put in there for her to be benevolent and watch over, and just to be able to um, spread his presence and kingdom through.
I think one thing that's really interesting about this as well is that um, Sarai took, like you said, Hagar. Now
Mm-hmm.
let's give a little background on Hagar real
Mm-hmm.
quick. Hagar is one of Abram's wife, Sarai, one of Sarai's maidservants. So she's a slave in Sarai's household, and I would imagine that she was probably most likely acquired when they were in Egypt that first time.
Yep.
And so when they went down to Egypt and they had that whole scenario down there, and Abram was like, "Oh, tell them you're my sister, so they don't kill me." And they went through the whole deal. Well, it said that they came out of there with maidservants and men servants, and so their household was filled um, with slaves like this. And so Hagar was one of Sarai's servants, and she was probably not there by choice. She was. Some scholars thought that maybe she might be Ethiopian, and that she was taken from Ethiopia and sold into slavery in Egypt. And while she was there, that's where Abram and Sarai acquired her. But all that to be said, she's probably young. She is not there by choice.
Mm-hmm.
She has been forced into this life that she lives in servitude. And yeah, you could just tell like she has no real autonomy. And so in this situation, it's not just merely a situation where Abram decides to marry this woman. This is a young child um, who is being forced into marriage with this man who is the husband of the woman she works for.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of one other thing in there as well. You kind of brought up Egypt in there again. And we're
Mm-hmm.
also just really highlighting a huge character flaw. I think God's trying to point out in Abram at this point in time as well. And it seems that, Sarai's chosen to participate in this, is that whenever Abram doesn't know what to do, or whenever he gets into trouble, he runs to Egypt.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
goes to look by doing his things through his own means. So in that story that we talked about a second ago, he there was a famine, so he went to Egypt to go take care of something by his own means instead of partnering in what God said. Well, he's like, all right, God just told me that we're going to have a kid. I don't know how we're going
Mm,
to do this. So how about we do this by our own means?
yeah.
So as opposed to just taking Genesis chapter 15, which is probably one of the biggest highlights of Abram's success, and just continuing it on, we see honestly the exact opposite of that in the fact that Abram doesn't just decide to keep on trusting in the story and the promise that God had. He decides to run back to Egypt
Hmm.
via Sarai's Egyptian slave. And I think that's a pretty big theme that we'll kind of see throughout the rest of Genesis, especially.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. And what is interesting about this is this narrative is meant, like you said, to highlight Abram's deficiencies, highlight Abram's lack of trust, lack of faith, lack of trusting in the story. But here's what happens too often. I know myself growing up and all the churches that I was a part of,
Mm-hmm.
they highlighted Hagar as being a villainous woman. And so which is really surprising to me, because they would kind of lump her in with like uh,
Jezebel.
Jezebel, yeah, Samson and Delilah,
Yeah.
just these wicked women who are scheming. But this was not that. Hagar was not a wicked woman who was scheming anything. She was a victim of a system that she found herself in against her own will, and then was being forced into a marriage that was being coerced by two acting parties for their own benefits.
Yeah, I agree. And this is really a good opportunity, at least to highlight that there's a lot of people here in the Bible, whether it be the New Testament, the Old Testament, that are prime examples of people that you don't want to be.
Right.
Like there's some really good characteristics and things that God does in partnership with those people, but just because they're a major character in the story, it doesn't mean that they're just automatically good and we should justify what they did. They're actually realistically in there for us to learn from their mistakes and
Hmm.
take those lessons in there.
Yeah,
So if
more
you're
than their
putting,
successes.
yeah, if you're putting all the characters in the Bible, especially Abram's himself and his sons and his grandsons
Hmm.
and his direct descendants into this and say that, oh, this is the pedestal and this is who we should be, um, I wouldn't necessarily want to be your friend.
Right. Right. Because some of these mistakes are so big and so detrimental. And so that raises the question then, Nick, is then if they're so bad, like if Abram makes such big mistakes, why does God still choose to use him?
Well, he's got a redeeming presence about him. And he's a good God to say that even through these insufficient humans, I can work out my story and work out my plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, there's only one man, and it took God coming in man form that ever led a perfect life, and that was Jesus. So I think we should actually find quite a bit of appreciation for the fact that God takes imperfect people,
Yeah.
because it also shows he's trying to download to us that he can partner with us in any of our circumstances. Your past doesn't define you. It's about your partnership with him.
Yeah. Look at verse 3 where it says, well, in verse 2 it says Abram agreed to what Sarai had said. So Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. Here's what's interesting about this is even though Abram already had a wife, she gave Hagar to Abram as a wife, but
Mm-hmm.
Abram didn't treat Hagar like a wife. Does it make sense? And
Yeah.
so there's there's this like level of equality, I guess, going on between Abram and Sarai that is not there between him and Hagar. Essentially, it seems like they're wanting to just follow the rules so that they said that they followed the rules. But his marriage to Hagar seemed only like a kind of a formality to be able to get what he wanted, for Sarai to be able to get what she wanted. And I don't know what Sarai was thinking. I don't know if Sarai was thinking, oh, Hagar will get pregnant and have the baby, and we'll just take the baby from her, and I'll keep it for myself. Like, was that part of the original plan? Was that what she was kind of gaming for?
Yeah, I don't know. The big part is it kind of echoes back to that treating like livestock scenario right there.
Yeah.
Just because you if I own a cow and she has a calf, well, technically that's my calf. I guess the cow's still her mother, but it's more of like property in the way
Yeah.
that Sarah is still trying to treat her. It's not like she's actually a human being. Saying that she's just, I mean, realistically, and this is pretty bad to say, but this is also just goes to show like the type of people that we're dealing with right here in this story. She is just a a birthing machine in
Right.
this situation for Sarai. To which, in all honesty, if we start thinking about, back to the fall, um,
Mm-hmm.
whenever Eve's name was changed to Eve, it was not originally like Adam and Eve, it was Ish and Isha, so man and woman.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Eve's definition became by the fact that she could have children and she could be a mother. And that is really, instead of claiming a definition of who Hagar is as a person, she was given a title and a role that was just based off the fact that you can give me this and I'm going to manipulate you to get it.
Right. And so what I hear you saying is like with the whole Egyptian aspect, whenever we trust in the world system to get for ourselves, specifically getting for ourselves the promise that God has provided for us,
Mm-hmm.
that um, pursuing things in our own strength for our own story causes us to dehumanize the people around us in order to get what we want. For Hagar, like you said, it was being treated like cattle. Just breeding for the sake of trying to accumulate children or something. Yeah, it's gross. It's super
Yeah,
gross.
it's bad. But it's kind of that decreation and evolution of humans again. We just came off of
Mm-hmm.
a Garden of Eden moment with Abram and um, God in chapter 15,
Yeah,
but now
yeah,
we're getting to see the downward spiral. So I guess if we are tracking through the story and saying that that some things are probably holding consistent here, it's that we're likely going to see some of those events play back out so God can redeem this circumstance in this situation.
yeah.
Because without a doubt, he will redeem it.
Right, right. Because that's what he does.
Yeah.
Look at verse 4. Abram slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. When she realized that she was pregnant, she looked down on her mistress, who would have been Sarai.
Mm-hmm.
And then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and ever since she saw that she was pregnant, she has looked down on me. So may the Lord judge between me and you. And then Abram replied to Sarai, Here is your slave. Here, your slave is in your hands. So do whatever you want with her. Then Sarai mistreated her so much that Hagar ran away from her.
Yeah. And
Again,
I think, oh, go
the
ahead.
formality of calling her a wife
Mm-hmm.
versus the lack of treatment. Like she becoming Abram's wife never caused her to lose her slave status.
Yeah. And I mean, in all honesty, this is a really good time to go ahead and point out what kind of story that Abram's trying to participate in
Yeah.
right here. Do we remember the last person in the Bible that we ran into at this point in time that had two wives?
Was it Cain or Tubal Cain?
It was Lamech.
Lamech. Yeah. I
Yeah.
knew it was somewhere in that story.
No, you're good. Yeah, you're right. You're right there. In Genesis chapter 4, I think we run into this fellow named Lamech, who is, well, it should be pretty easy to find. So I'll just go ahead and do a quick scroll back to it. There we are. So in Genesis chapter 4, verses 23, it said, Lamech said to his wives, ooh, is that when it starts? Sorry. We're going to start up here in Genesis chapter 4, verse 19. Lamech took two wives. And then we'll go ahead and skip down to verse 23. And then Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. And if Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's revenge is 77-fold.
Hmm.
So honestly, at this point in time, we meet a person who had not only taken, one of the foundational sins that Cain
Mm-hmm.
participated in killing his brother, but he just, multiplied it. But if we can really say what's the biggest thing that Cain is doing is he's taking the Eden story of man and woman being made for one another and breaking it. So he's not only just participating in sin by killing somebody, but he is participating in a story that says God's creation and his perfect design is not good. So therefore, I need more to be able to satisfy myself because the Lord won't be able to take it. And we
Yeah.
see this really odd situation kind of start here to where every time we see two wives start being come back together, it honestly
Mm-hmm.
kind of points back to the fact that there was Lamech in there
Yeah.
because there was something in there that it will involve a wronging, there will involve favoritism, and there will involve something that's showing that you're not trusting God's design and his plan in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm trying to remember how we said it back in the first episodes, but there is a progression that the sin that you delve in only ever becomes progressively worse, right? And so it's
Mm-hmm.
this ongoing progression of sin getting greater and greater. And the greater that sin gets in our lives, the greater the consequence of that sin that ends up happening from our lives. And we look at this, and as soon as Sarai gets pregnant, now we got this contention between Sarai and Hagar, Sarai and Abram, and it doesn't really show us that Abram has contention with Hagar, but you can tell that he just doesn't care. He's like,
Yeah.
hey, I mean, look at verse 6. He's like, this is your servant. This is your slave. She is in your hands. You do with her whatever you want done. Like I washed my hands of this. Like he's completely disconnected from it.
Yeah. And if we also think about it, um, you know, his whole point was to get to that son, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he got there by his own means. But at that
Yeah.
point in time, not only is he disregarding Hagar, but he's also disregarding his son that came via Hagar. Then
Right.
it's
Right.
like he got what he wanted, but it wasn't satisfying to him. because he
Yeah.
didn't participate in the story of God and partnering with God to get it.
Right. Because it wasn't part of the promise. It was his own, it was the consequences of his own doing.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Let's go to verse 7. It says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar by the spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. He said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? What a great question. Like, where have you come from, and where are you going? Like, how often, like, because this angel knows exactly what's going on with Hagar. Like, why do you think that, what do you think he was trying to accomplish by that kind of question? Where have you come from, and where are you going? She replied, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, you must go back to your mistress and submit to her mistreatment. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count. And the angel of the Lord said to her, you have conceived, and you will have a son. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. This man will be like a wild donkey, and his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will live at odds with all of his brothers. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, the God who sees me. For she said, have I really seen here the one who sees me? That is why she named the spring a well of the living one who sees me. It is located between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son that Hagar had. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him.
Yeah. I think, in all honesty, there's a whole lot to unpack in this, but I think we probably need to kind of go back and start back at that question whenever you said where you come from and where are you going.
Yeah.
She was heading back home, and
Mm-hmm.
you don't really blame her for it. But the funny part is, God does not condemn her for that, but he actually meets her in her, you know, frightenedness, being scared, you know, in her state that she's in right there, and says that we have a whole lot more that we're going to do together in this. So she's going back to Egypt. And I think it's also kind of important to point out in this is that, you know, God is pretty much trying to download in this story, you know, you're not going back to Egypt. God
Right.
prevents her from doing it. And not only does
Mm-hmm.
she participate in it, and just trying to point out, you know, back to the fact that Hagar's not a bad person in this situation at all. She hasn't done anything wrong. She actually trusts the Lord more than Abram did in this story.
Right.
So if you
Yeah.
see this entire story, the one that's wronged is actually the one that's choosing to participate in the kingdom of God. So it's like,
Right.
where'd you come from and where are you going? He's pretty much just saying there is like, it doesn't matter where you're at. I'm with you in the middle of this.
Right. Well, and that's what's interesting is that when the angel of the Lord finds her, she's in the wilderness, and she just happened to find a spring in the wilderness on the way to Shur. And he said, where are you come from? Where are you going? She replied, I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai. So she only knew where she was coming from, right? And then the angel of the Lord said to her, you must go back to your mistress and submit to her mistreatment. Like, why would that be a word from the Lord? To go back and submit to the mistreatment that your mistress is giving you.
It's a deep question. Do you have an answer for it?
I don't, but I read it and I'm just thinking, dear goodness, like that is a tough word. But I do want to fast forward over to chapter 21 real quick. And this is where Isaac is born. 21 verse 8 says this, then the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son mocking I'm sorry. But Sarah saw the son mocking, the one Hagar, the Egyptian, had borne Abram. So she said to Abram, "Drive out this slave and her son, for the son of this slave will not be a co-heir with my son Isaac." Now, this was a very difficult thing for Abram because of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be concerned about the boy and your slave. Whatever Sarah says to you, listen, because your offspring will be traced through Isaac. But I will also make a nation of the slave's son, because he is your offspring." And then early in the morning, Abram got up, and he took bread and a water skin, and he put them on Hagar's shoulder, and he sent her and the boy away. She left and wandered into the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she left the boy under one of the bushes, and she went and sat down nearby, and was about a bow shot away, because she said, "I cannot bear to watch the boy die." So as she sat nearby, she wept loudly. God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What's wrong, Hagar? Don't be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy from the place where he is. Get up and help the boy up and sustain him, for I will make him a great nation." Then God opened the eyes of Hagar, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the water skin and gave it to the boy for a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew. And he grew, and he settled in the wilderness and became an archer. He settled in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So that'll be another story to really look into. But the point that I was wanting to make is the second time that Sarai sent Hagar and Ishmael away, they found themselves in the same place. And the place that they found themselves in was in the same place where they were at the first time, where God said, "I am the God who sees you." Hagar was actually the first person in Scripture who gets to give God a name other than the name he's already called himself. And so she calls the angel of the Lord. She says that he is the God who sees me. Do you remember the name of that? It's
El Shaddai.
Yes, but there's another one. She names the whole city that. We'll have to come back to it later.
Yeah.
Something beer Roy or something like that.
I think El Roy, ROI,
Yeah.
it's Bir La Roy.
Beer Roy.
Yeah. If my footnote is tracking
Yeah.
with what you're trying to say.
Yeah. And that beer Roy is, I believe it means the God who sees me.
Yeah, it says the living one. It means the living one who sees me.
Yeah.
Is what that means. But I just kind of want to also unpack something a little bit interesting in here too. Is the name of Ishmael?
Yeah.
It means God hears me.
Mm.
So it's kind of unique, the fact that she says, "You will name your son God hears me." And then not only is Hagar moved by the situation enough that she recognizes that God hears her, but she says that God sees me too. So it's kind of unique to where it says God's going to take your name, and it will be God will hear you, but he also sees you in every situation as well, which really ties greatly into that story a little bit later, whenever God hears, weeping, and comes back for Ishmael. But I think if we really just kind of take that and set on it, maybe that's something, listeners should do by themselves, is the fact that whenever God says that he's there for you, do you think that he's just there to see you, or does he also hear you as well? Because not only did Hagar believed that God heard her, but he saw her in her presence too.
Yeah. And I know I'm kind of all over the place this evening, but when we fast forward also to when Abraham was sacrificing Isaac, the Lord told Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. After that whole situation, Abram goes back home, but Isaac doesn't go with him. And then you go, and Abram finds a wife for his son Isaac, and it says or fast forward to chapter 24, starting in verse 61. It says, "Then Rebekah and her young woman got up, mounted the camels, and followed the man. So the servant took Rebekah and left." Verse 62. "Now Isaac was returning from where? From Beer Laharoi,
Mm-hmm.
for he was living in the Negev region." So, who lives in Beer Laharoi? That's where Hagar and Ishmael live.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting that even though Hagar had been dismissed, even though Ishmael had been sent out, they settled in Beer Laharoi, and in the place where God sees them and hears them. And Isaac, specifically after two traumatic events, one, attempting to be sacrificed by his dad, and then two, losing his mother, the place that he goes to comfort is a place named the God who sees me, with a brother that says the God who hears me. And so the greatest comfort and healing we can receive, whether you are Hagar, whether you are Ishmael, or whether you are Isaac, is coming to a place where you know that God sees you, coming to a place where you know that God hears you. He's not going to leave you. He's not going to forsake you. He's there to provide for you. And that place of provision is not just going to be material provision, but it's going to be a provision of peace and comfort and restoration.
Yeah. And there's a whole lot to unpack on Genesis 22.
Oh, I know. And I hate to jump ahead like that, but sometimes I just want to make those pieces fit, because it's not just Hagar who God is seen. It is Ishmael. It is Isaac. It is a whole region of the land, Beer Laharoi, that says the God who sees me.
Yeah, exactly. I do think it's also, kind of important to unpack a little bit about Ishmael in this situation as well, because we have a unique little situation here where we have a firstborn son, right? A firstborn son who is going to be suffering some, and we don't have to unpack this all right now, but maybe just some stuff to keep in mind as we go throughout the story. A firstborn son who's about to suffer some rejection. It doesn't mean that he was not loved by his father, because I do think after Abram, he actually gets to meet Ishmael, he is loved by his father.
Right.
But he is a firstborn son that suffers some rejection. There's some things to kind of keep in mind as we go back to really that Genesis 4 story. Whenever we're talking about Cain and Abel, there's going to be some Cain and Abel like qualities between Ishmael and Isaac that we're going to actually really see unfold in front of us as well. But I think that the author is really just doing a good job to give us some hints about that, specifically in this story, or in verse 11 of chapter 16, whenever he talks about, God has listened to your affliction. When's the last time that we kind of heard God listening to someone, or the first time really is whenever he heard Cain's or Abel's blood crying out from the ground. And then we have kind of another term in there was talking about how Ishmael will be a wild donkey of a man. First of all, Jeremiah, would you appreciate being called a wild donkey of a man?
Probably not the compliment I'm looking for. No.
Yeah. It is just going ahead and pointing out that, there is a lot at play right here that's part of kind of that decreation story as well. because a wild donkey of a man sounds more like a beastly man as
Right.
opposed to one that's maybe living into the plan that God has. So
Mm.
I don't know, just some stuff to sit with as we continue to go throughout this story. It's really, generational wrongdoings that we
Yeah.
get to see
Yeah.
replayed over and over again. But it does point out the fact that each generation has an opportunity. Um, and Hagar, in my opinion, succeeded.
Yeah.
Um, at least through the situation and things that she was presented. Um, Ishmael's going to have his own story. Isaac's going to have his own story.
Yeah.
It's just really about what they choose to do in terms of partnership with the Lord and it all.
Yeah. And I think that's it. That's the key. But Hagar obeys.
Mm-hmm.
She goes back home and submits to her submits back to Sarai and has the baby. It says so Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram gave him the name Ishmael to the son that Hagar had. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. So 86, and then you get into chapter 17, then Abram was 99, right?
Yep.
So that boy would have been about 13 by the time Isaac was born.
Yeah.
Yep.
This is the firstborn by quite some time.
Yeah, that's wild, huh?
Yeah. And there's a lot of irony that happens in chapter 17 that we
Yep.
are going to get to talk about on the next time.
Yeah. This is probably a good point to end it, though. So, yeah, I hope that we can just really continue to reflect in on that, the God who sees me aspect. Whether it is we're part of God's original plan, like Abram and Sarai have been, or if we are parts of, let's say, supporting parts of God's plan, like Hagar and Ishmael are. Either way, we can find comfort in that place knowing that God himself, he sees us and he hears us and he has a plan for us.
Love it. And I think it's honestly some stuff that we have to wrestle with in our own life. Do we think that God only hears us or God only sees us, or if he's going to be there in every situation all the way true? Are we trusting him fully?
Right. That's good. That's good. Well, we will call it there today. It's the Jude 23 Community Podcast, episode 21 of season 2, unofficially. Man, it is so good to be back together with you guys. We had a little bit of a break, but we will have a little bit more consistency here in the new year. And yeah, we're excited about it. So God bless, and make sure you tune in again next time, and we will talk to you all soon.